In this video, I'm going to show you how to color printer paper with acrylic paint to enhance the look of your origami models. First, the supplies. Of course, we need some printer paper. This is a very plain paper. Then I've got some painter's tape, I've got acrylic paints. Now in this video I'm going to be using three colors: ultramarine, violet, and to add a bit of shimmer and sparkle, I'm also going to be using some metallic gold acrylic paint. To thin that down a little, I'm going to be using plain water, and to apply I'm going to be using some sponges. I'm also using an old cutting mat, and I'm going to fix one sheet of printer paper using that painter's tape. Now that's because printer paper doesn't take water that well, and I didn't want it to rip while I was handling the paper, so I decided it was slightly better to actually fix it down. I've also done some coloring without fixing the paper, and that also works. You just have to be a bit more careful. Now I've got these sponges here. They're really plain sponges which you might use in your kitchen or so. And then I'm just going to apply a bit of color. I'm going to start with gold because I want to have a base shimmer on the paper. I'm going to smush it together just a little bit and then put that sponge in the water to add some water here. And then I'm going to squeeze out just a little bit of water because sometimes I get too much water and I just want to be careful with that printer paper. And now I'm just going over in a relatively random pattern. I like to actually go in these swirling motions, and you can tap it a little to get like these bubbles which give a really nice texture. Noted, this will be covered up by a lot of other color, but applying many layers of color, or at least a couple, will give this nice depth to the paper because you're not covering the complete paper, but always just covering some spots, so they will always shine through. And when I'm happy with that, I just let that dry a little so that it's not as wet anymore. I'm a bit of an impatient sort, especially while recording a video, so I decided to use a heat tool to speed up the process a little, but it shouldn't take too long in either case. Now, once the paper is sufficiently dry, it's still slightly damp, that's okay. I'm going to use the first color. In this case, it's going to be ultramarine. And then again, apply it directly to the sponge. As you can see here, I'm taking a bit less and being a bit more careful because it's a very strong color. I'm again smushing it together a little, adding some water, not adding too much, and again smushing it so that all of the color is slightly damp, and then I'm just going over in strokes. I like to use slightly different patterns, and here you can see the paper is still relatively damp and it crinkles a little sometimes on the sides, but if you take care to use a slightly larger sheet than you actually need, then you're fine because you can cut off those wrinkles if you don't like them. Or actually you might even like the effect that achieves. So here you can see, rather than swirling, I'm going in strokes and adding only very little color at this point, just because I wanted to have a slightly lighter look. And you can always add more color, but it's difficult to remove color. So I have that base of ultramarine, and now I'm going to go ahead with the violet and add more violet. Really wanted to have a nice strong violet hue on this sheet, and now I'm going in swirls and you can see that really deep color, very rich and absolutely beautiful. Here you can see there's these wrinkles. I try to straighten them out just a little bit. I do like to apply quite a bit of water. If you use watercolor paper or elephant hide or something like that, you don't have to be quite as careful because the paper takes the water much better. Again, here I'm pouncing down the sponge to get this different kind of texture too, and again I'm going to dry it, or you can just simply let it dry. It'll just take a couple of minutes, but with a heat tool it's just a couple of seconds. And after I have these colors applied, I always like to finish it off with some more gold to have these highlights and to have an extra shimmer to the paper, which I think is just absolutely beautiful and which can be easily achieved with the metallic acrylic paints. Here you can see I'm again swirling and pouncing, and I really do, especially now, like to pounce a bit more and get bigger bubbles in some cases so that you have these nice splotches on the paper. So here you can see I'm pressing a bit harder to get a bit bigger bubbles on the paper. And then again, I just let that dry, or actually use the heat tool to speed up the drying process. Now at this point the paper was just damp and not wet anymore. I'm lifting it here a bit so you can perhaps see a bit of that shimmer that the gold brings, and then very carefully lifted the paper because I knew I wanted to also color the reverse. Here, turning it over, you can see the paper is still a bit damp in some spots, but that's totally okay. And for the reverse, I just went with a very simple coloring of gold and nothing too fancy. Again, smooshing the color together a little bit and then going over quite carefully. This time I didn't tape it down, and I just wanted to have a bit of gold to tie the reverse of the paper together with the front. And then I'm just drying the paper again, just so that it's ready to be folded while I'm recording. Again, you can just leave it out to dry if you want to. Now, because we did add water to this paper, it warped a little. So what I'm next going to do is first remove that painter's tape very carefully so that we don't damage the paper that we actually want to use. And then we're going to take 2 sheets of paper, one below and one on top. And then I'm just going to take my iron and I'm going to iron over the sheet on the very lowest setting pretty much that you have. Because you don't need a lot of heat. I just want to flatten this out a little bit and maybe dry the sheet a bit more. Don't go with too much heat because the color might melt and it might stick to the sheets, and you really don't want that. You could also simply leave it overnight between some books. For example, I would sandwich it between 2 sheets so that the books don't take on the color, and also the paper can soak up some of the humidity of the other paper. And once you've finished ironing that, that's the resulting sheet that you can cut squares from now, or whatever shape you need. I think it's really fantastic, and here again you can see that nice shimmer that the gold acrylic paint adds. And I decided to fold the Alexander Swallowtail butterfly by Michael LaFosse. If you want to fold this butterfly too, Michael LaFosse did an instructional video which is available on pem.org/origami. And also Tadashi Mori did a tutorial which is available on YouTube. And isn't that an absolutely gorgeous origami butterfly? Who would think it was folded from some basic printer paper, just customized a little bit with acrylic paint? And wouldn't you agree that it was so very simple and really fast too? And it makes such gorgeous presents, and it's simply just really fun experimenting with color. And now that you know how to color printer paper with acrylic paint, how about you check out Leila Torres' video on how to use oil pastels instead. Or check out my videos on how to make tissue foil paper or double tissue paper, which are both excellent for folding even complex origami models. Subscribe to my channel so you don't miss my next videos. And finally, do check out my website happyfolding.com for more origami content. I hope to see you around, and happy folding!